Okay, that's better. Hello, Jacksonites. It is my final day of my vacation, so I figure I probably would want to do something that ends this 9 day time of bliss for myself on a high note. So today, doing take two because I was interrupted yesterday, I will be beginning my read through of the original Return of the Living Dead short novel by John Russo. Now, John Russo will probably be a very familiar name to a bunch of zombie fans. So, of course, the original Night of the Living Dead was released in 1968, directed by George Romero. It was also co written by George Romero as well as um, John Russo. While John Russo's contributions to the zombie genre are not nearly as legendary as George Romero himself, John Russo also has contributed a fair bit of stuff to the zombie genre in and of himself. To briefly give you a little bit of history, so not only did John Russo write this novel, but John Russo was also an executive producer for the 30th anniversary edition of Night of the Living Dead. And he was also an executive producer and one of the original writers for 2001's Children of the Living Dead, which, funny enough, the 30th anniversary edition of Night of the Living Dead changes around Night of the Living Dead to the point where it ended up becoming its own film. Because Children of the Living Dead, in and of itself, is supposed to be a sequel to the 30th anniversary edition of Night of the Living Dead. Um, we all know about the whole copyright issues that surrounded Night of the Living Dead. They changed the title from Night of Anubis to Night of the Living Dead, and they forgot to put the copyright claim somewhere on the film. So that's how the film slipped in the public domain. And it seems like John Russo was always quite bitter about that ever since that occurred. And I'm pretty sure one big reason why the 30th anniversary edition was made in the first place was so that John Russo could get some kind of copyright claim on Night of the Living Dead in some form or fashion. Um, but that's not the only time, of course, that John Russo tried to make his own series spun off of the original Night of the Living Dead. Because in 1978 or 9, I've heard both, John Russo wrote, of course, this novel, Return of the Living Dead. This is not connected to the 1985 film of the same name, at least not directly. So, again, this was released in either 78 or 79, and it does serve as its own standalone sequel to Night of the Living Dead. To my knowledge, there's no mention of Dawn or Day. Well, Day hadn't been out yet, but yeah, there's no mention of Dawn in this novel, to my knowledge. And it really does function as its own sequel to Night. And um, the John Russo wanted to have this book be made into a film. I think there was a producer named Tom Fox who would have hired Toby Hooper of Texas Chainsaw Massacre fame to direct an adaptation of this book, which I think that would have been kind of cool. As much as I don't like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I do think Toby Hooper would have done a pretty decent job doing a zombie movie. So it's kind of a shame that he never did that. But yeah, obviously plans for this fell through. So Tom Fox went on to somebody else and eventually found Dan O'Bannon, of course, who was the writer on the original Alien. And Tom Fox hired Dan to do an adaptation of this novel, but Dan decided not to adapt the script, which was written by John Russo based on this book, because apparently, paraphrasing from his words, he felt like he would have been intruding on Romero's turf if he was to make his own spiritual sequel to Night of the Living Dead, so he decided not to. And he took that script and he rewrote it from the ground up and turned it into the 1985 Return of the Living Dead movie, which bears pretty much no resemblance to this novel as far as I'm concerned, obviously. Um, and it kind of seems like this book is a very obscure and very lesser known part of what I'm calling the Romero Russo Living Dead legacy. I've seen no other videos like reviewing or reading through this book. It seems like this is just a very, very um, unknown part of Romero's zombie legacy, which is kind of a shame. Fuck my nose. Um, but yeah, I'm really excited to check this out. I read the final chapter when I first got this, and it does end on a pretty reminiscent of George Romero type ending in that it's very abrupt and ambiguous and kind of bleak. Um, I don't other than that, I don't know what happens in this novel. I'm going into this completely blind. Although I do know a couple snippets from a couple reviews on Amazon, which by the way, if you want to get this book on Amazon, this cost me 10 bucks. It's very inexpensive. And it's not very long either. It's only about it's 159 pages long. So it's practically a Goosebumps book. Yeah, if you want to get your hands on this, it's very inexpensive. Um, but a couple little snippets of reviews that I saw on Amazon stated that there is some pretty messed up stuff that happens in this book. There is apparently some beatings and some sexual assaults, possibly, or some kind of nasty stuff along those lines that happens in this book. So I do give a trigger warning or a viewer discretion is advised warning. If that kind of stuff is a little too intense for you, you might want to tread lightly. So, with all that being said, horror and metal is here. Yo, horror and metal channel. Yes, I will do that every single time. And with all that being said, let us jump right into reading Return of the Living Dead. Again, that title just rolls right off your tongue. And actually, before we begin, a word from our sponsor. Prologue. And by the way, I will interject sometimes and give my own commentary on what's happening. So it's not just going to be me droning on and reading this entire thing. And by the way, I don't know how long this is going to be, and I don't know how many parts this is going to be. Um, I am kind of a fast reader, but I also do want to take my time and read carefully so that there's as little stutters and dead space as possible. So I think at most this will probably be a two-part read through. But anyway, prologue. Think of all the people who have lived and died and will never again see the trees or the grass or the sun. It all seems so brief, so worth nothing. To live for a short while and then die. It all seems to add up to so very little. Why do we fight so hard to stay alive, to preserve life, to hang on to that fleeting flicker of something which nobody has been able to define? It is easy to envy the dead ones. They are beyond living and beyond dying. They are lucky to be dead, to be done with dying, and to not have to fear the inevitable, to not have to struggle for life that is threatened, to be under the ground, oblivious, to be oblivious of hurting, oblivious of the fear of dying. They do not have to live anymore, or feel pain, or accomplish anything, or wonder what to do next. or wonder what it is going to be like to have to go through dying. Why does life seem so ugly and beautiful and sad and important while you are living it, and so trivial when it is over? The fire of life smolders a while and then is extinguished, and the graves wait patiently to be filled. The end of all life is death, and the new life sings happily in the breeze, and neither knows nor cares anything about the old life, and then it in turn also dies. Life is a constant, endless creation of graves. Things live and then die, and sometimes they live well and sometimes poorly, but they always die, and death is the common denominator of all things living, the one thing that sends all things to oblivion. What is it that makes people afraid of dying? Not pain, not always. Death can be instantaneous and almost painless. Death itself is an end to pain. Death can be like falling asleep. Then why are people afraid to die? And which of us, once dead, would wish to forsake the peace of death to return to life again? Again, John Russo really nailing into the existential question, existential crisis, what is life and what is death stuff that makes me kind of uncomfortable. I don't like thinking about death because I low key feel like I have thanatophobia. Chapter 1. Dawn is a time of rebirth. All life senses this, the rising again to face new beginnings. Our story begins at dawn. Or should we say, our story begins again. Orange light fired the morning, accenting the colors of a green, wooded landscape. A pickup truck shuddered through the woods, raising a cloud of dust as it bounced over the ruts in the dusty road between the trees. The people in the truck were in a hurry to get somewhere, and they were late. Bert Miller, an angry looking man wearing an old fashioned suit that looked new because it was worn so seldom, tended to the business of keeping his truck under control, a task he performed with a combination of anger and skill. Anger that caused him to drive too fast and would make an accident seem inevitable, and skill that prevented that accident from happening. Bert was about 40 years old, with the weathered face and calloused hands of a farmer. He had a shock of straight black hair that refused to stay down, no matter how it had been wetted and parted and combed, although Bert did not wet and comb it too often. A farmer is what he was, and he wanted to be nothing else, even if his farm was not a rich one and he had to work excessively hard every day of his life to scratch out a meager living for himself and his 3 daughters. Yeah, no thanks. Farmer life is not for me. His wife was dead. She had died giving birth to their youngest daughter, Karen, who was pregnant herself and was sitting with Bert on the seat of the pickup truck. Of course, her name is Karen. Well, I don't really think the Karen stereotype was a thing back in the late 70s. Karen was very tense and scared, clutching her armrest, hoping her father would not see her being frightened and use it as an excuse to yell at her while he continued to drive as fast as possible, negotiating tight, twisting curves and sharp upgrades by what seemed to Karen to be a combination of luck and bullheadedness. In the back of the truck, bouncing and sliding, were Karen's 2 sisters, Anne and Sue Ellen. They were more scared than Karen and had reason to be. Their seat in the back of the careening truck was a low wooden bench on which they had to sit to keep their dresses clean. Sitting in the bed of the truck would doubtless have been safer, for the bench was unanchored and bounced and vibrated terribly with each lurch of the truck. They had known what sort of ride they were in for, and were not at all surprised by it, considering how angry their father was that morning after the argument at home. It was Karen's fault that they were late. In her 8th month of pregnancy, she had gotten up that morning complaining of nausea and weakness. That had been enough to set Bert to yelling. He accused Karen of faking morning sickness to get out of doing her Christian duty with the rest of the family, and had gone on shouting that it wasn't enough that she had to disgrace him by giving birth to a child without being married, but she also didn't have any respect for anybody dead or living and had lost her religion, and it was enough to cause her poor dead mother to turn over in her grave. Well, presumably this takes place in the South, so this mindset still was very common and prevalent back in the late 70s. Sadly, I feel for this girl. Bert had insisted Karen get dressed and come along with the rest of the family, ignoring her protests that she was sick. But in deference to her pregnancy, he had made her climb into the front seat of the truck while his other two daughters sat in the back. Then, because they were going to be late and because Bert needed very excuse me, and because Bert needed very little provocation to bring his anger over Karen's illegitimate pregnancy bursting to the surface, Bert had gunned the truck out, grinding gears and spewing gravel, and they had lurched towards their destination. "It's going to be our funeral if he doesn't slow down," Sue Ellen said, as she and Anne hung onto the sides of the bench as if it would offer them any stability and protection during the bone-shaking ride. Anne did not reply, even though the noise of the truck on the dirt and gravel road was deafening. She was afraid her father would hear them talking. "He can't hear from up there," Sue Ellen said, reading her sister's thoughts. But still, Anne said nothing. The dirt road straightened out a bit and became smoother for a stretch of about half a mile that it was relatively safe to take at high speed, as long as there wasn't any incoming traffic. But at least the wooden bench stopped bouncing and the two girls relaxed ever so slightly. There was only one more set of curves and another straightaway where they would come up on the Dorsey farmhouse. Bert Miller gunned the truck a little, braked it for the curves, scaring his daughters, and slowed when he got into the straightaway and saw it lined, as expected, with all the cars and trucks of the farmers who lived in the valley. Some people had been able to park in a field near the side of the Dorsey house, and when the field had filled up, the rest had just squeezed their vehicles over to one side, as far off the narrow dirt road as possible. Bert Miller did the same, slamming his pickup truck to a halt and getting out and banging the door shut without so much as a glance over his shoulder at any of his daughters. He would have treated them that way even if he had not been angry. He expected them to fend for themselves. What a nice sounding man. Anne and Sue Ellen climbed down from the bed of the truck, being careful not to soil their clean print dresses, and came around to help Karen get down from the cab. Bert Miller had already advanced 20 or 30 paces towards the Dorsey farm. Are you going to call him by his full name every single time, John? The house. Nobody was standing on the porch, and he assumed that meant the services were in progress. Bert pulled the knot of his tie and made an attempt to flatten a stubborn cowlick with the palm of his hand as he continued walking. Karen stepped tentatively and awkwardly off the running board, helped by her two sisters, then straightened up and tugged her maternity blouse down over her belly. She felt embarrassed and undignified and was aware that all the people inside the Dorsey house would know she was pregnant without being married. "I didn't want to come," she said. "They're all going to gossip." "You're going to have to face it sooner or later," Anne said. "If not now, after the babies." She cut herself off, having seen their father staring at them angrily, waiting for them to come along. He was on the porch, having halted there so they could enter together as a family. As they approached the house, the girls could hear people crying inside. Bert Miller opened the screen door and entered, with his daughters behind them. The living room was jammed with people, some filling all the sofas and chairs, the rest standing. The coffin was against a wall on the far side of the room, resting on what looked like a low table or some sawhorses and boards which had been draped with a white sheet and then surmounted with flowers. In the coffin was the body of a child, a 9-year-old girl, the youngest Dorsey daughter. She had died of rheumatic fever. What's that, hun? Oh, she didn't hear me. There was a stirring among the congregation as the Miller family entered the room, a self-conscious stirring because a prayer had been about to begin, and nobody knew whether to interrupt the prayer to greet the latecomers. Also, there was the sight of Karen's obvious pregnancy. Over by the coffin, Reverend Michaels continued to thumb through his prayer book, seemingly unaware of any interruption. The parents of the dead child were standing next to the Reverend, staring into the small coffin with faces full of helpless, dumb-stricken grief. Having found the appropriate prayer, Reverend Michaels turned towards his congregation and saw that Bert Miller, again, are you going to call him by his full name every single time? And his 3 daughters had arrived. Please be seated or stand quietly, the Reverend admonished them. The service is about to begin. He stared at Bert Miller, letting the man know that his tardiness was noticed, then allowed his disapproving eyes to fasten on Karen and linger there, staring into her eyes until she averted them by bowing her head in shame and embarrassment. Bunch of crazy Bible thumpers. Mr. and Mrs. Dorsey continued to stare at the coffin all the while, not sure how to act or what to say, and almost beyond caring about the formalities of the service in their anguish over the death of their young daughter. I ask each and all of you to join me in prayer, Reverend Michaels said. And after a short pause, he began the funeral prayer that each member of the congregation was expected to know by heart. I'd be miserable in this community. May the soul rest in peace. May the soul leave her body. May the body remain. May the body turn to dust as the Lord has spoken. May the body never rise again. Release the soul unto heaven, and all else turn to dust. During the prayer, several of the mourners readjusted their seating to make room for Karen, while her father and sisters remained standing in the rear of the room. The prayer finished, Reverend Michaels closed his prayer book. The congregation remained very still and silent, not shuffling and stirring as often happens at the conclusion of group prayer. There was no sound in the room except for quiet weeping. Reverend Michaels looked toward the rear of the room as if expecting something for which he did not have to ask. The service was clearly not over. The parents of the dead child, the mother sobbing quietly, the father silently showing the strain of his grief in his eyes, continued to stand arm in arm by the open casket. The grief and sadness in the room was suddenly accompanied by an undercurrent of tension. The Reverend continued to look to the back of the room. Pairs of eyes, previously focused on the faces of the distraught parents, began to turn in the direction of the door. After a few moments, the mother, too, stopped sobbing and looked up, joining her husband's gaze as she looked over the heads of the congregants. Now all weeping had ceased, and no one seemed to be breathing. All was still, as if the dozens of eyes were willing something to happen. A man in the far corner of the room stood up, and all the eyes stared at what he held in his hands. The man was tall, lean, and wearing a worn brown suit. He walked across the rear of the room and came down a path cleared for him by the mourners. All eyes stared at the large wooden mallet he carried. He walked slowly through the room, looking hard at the father of the dead child. He approached the coffin and gave the mallet to Mr. Dorsey. At the same time, placing his left hand sympathetically on the grieved father's shoulder. Reverend Michaels produced in his right hand a large metal spike, similar to the kind that were used in the construction of railroads. This sounds more like a vampire thing than a zombie thing. The Reverend handed the spike to Mr. Dorsey. The faces of the assembled mourners were tense and expectant as they all looked in the direction of the coffin. There was no sound now but a few shuffling footsteps. The dim light in the room seemed to accentuate the silence. As most of the congregation watched, Mr. Dorsey placed the spike to his dead child's forehead, and then, with the reverberating sound of wood against metal, the father pounded the spike deep into the skull of his daughter. Aside from that, it does still sound very vampire-ish. Tears streamed down the man's solid, silent face. Mrs. Dorsey screamed, unable to control herself, and continued to sob in anguish in the arms of several of the women who rushed forward to comfort her. Suddenly, the screen door burst open and slammed against the farmhouse wall with a crash. A small boy stood in the doorway, excited and out of breath, his eyes on Reverend Michaels as the symbol of authority. "It fell," he cried. "The bus. It rolled over and over. I was right there. It went right over the hill. Everybody, all of them dead, I think." Everyone in the congregation began shouting questions at once. A man in the back of the room near the door began shaking the boy to get more information out of him. "Where did it happen? When?" he demanded. Everyone in the congregation. Oh, wait. No, hang on. "At the crossroads, a few minutes ago. The bus wrecked and fell," the boy repeated, trying to catch his breath. Reverend Michaels became stern. He shouted for the attention of his congregation. They faced him, waiting for his instructions. They needed the authority of his voice, though they all would have predicted what he would say. If there were dead people on the bus, and if some would die later as the result of injuries, the spikes needed to be driven into their skulls to ensure that the peace of death would be final and complete as the Lord had intended. So obviously, if you're paying attention, this kind of reminds me of a zombie comedy called Fido, where it's very reminiscent of something that sounds George Romero-ish. But whenever people die, they're buried in coffins and their heads are taken off and their heads are buried in separate coffins to prevent reanimation. The spikes through the skull is obviously something that also prevents reanimation as a zombie. "You all know what needs to be done," Reverend Michaels intoned solemnly, "but we must hurry. There is not much time." The congregation began to move, people scrambling, hurrying out of the room. Several men had bags of spikes and mallets, which had become symbols of death and were often brought to funerals. Others always carried these items with them in their cars. Bert Miller, again using his whole name, turned to face his daughters, and, terribly frightened, had buried her face in her hands. She backed against the wall as her father moved toward her. "I don't want to go," she yelled desperately, cringing from her father. Bert seized Anne by the wrists and shook her to bring her face up so he could stare into her eyes. "You're going, and so Sue Ellen. The only one who ain't going is Karen, because she's pregnant. She can stay here and wait for us to get back." The rest of the people had already piled out of the room as Anne and Sue Ellen were shoved out ahead of their father. Karen watched, scared and shaking. Chapter 2. Excerpt from a civil defense broadcast made during the emergency which beset the eastern half of the United States 10 years ago. Up to the minute reports inform us that the siege, first documented 24 hours ago, has indeed spread over most of the eastern United States. Medical and scientific advisors have been summoned to the White House, and reporters on the scene in Washington inform us that the president is planning to make public the results of that conference in an address to the nation over your civil defense emergency network. Oh, what's up, Andrew from Texas Guy Movie Reviews? Reading Return of the Living Dead, the original novel. The strange beings that have appeared in alarming numbers seem to have certain predictable patterns of behavior. In the few hours following initial reports of violence and death and apparently deranged attacks on the lives of people taken completely off guard, it has been established that the alien beings have many human physical and behavioral characteristics. Hypotheses as to their origin and their aims have to this point been so varied and so diverse that we must only report these factors to be unknown. Teams of scientists and physicians have the corpses of several of the aggressors, and these corpses are being studied at this moment for clues that might negate or confirm existing theories. The most overwhelming fact is that these beings are infiltrating through urban and rural areas throughout the eastern half of the nation in forces of varying number, and if they have not yet been evidenced themselves in your area, please take every available precaution. Attack may come at any time, in any place, without warning. Repeating the important facts from our previous reports, there is an aggressive force, an army of unexplained, unidentified humanoid beings. They have appeared at random at various urban and rural locations throughout the eastern states. These beings are totally aggressive and irrational in their violence. Civil defense efforts are underway, and investigations as to the origin and purpose of the aggressors are being conducted. All citizens are urged to take utmost precautionary measures to defend themselves against this insidious alien force. These beings are weak in physical strength, however, and are easily distinguishable from humans by their deformed appearance. They are usually unarmed but appear capable of handling weapons. They have appeared without any reason or plan. Unlike organized armies as we know them, they seem to be driven by the urges of entranced or obsessed minds. They appear to be totally unthinking. They can, I repeat, they can be stopped by immobilization. They can be stopped by blinding or dismemberment. They are, remember, weaker in strength than the average adult human, but their strength is in numbers, in surprise, and in fact that their existence is beyond our normal realm of understanding. They appear to be irrational, non communicative beings, and they are definitely to be considered our enemies in what we must call a state of dire emergency. If encountered, they are to be avoided or destroyed. Under no circumstances should you allow yourselves or your families to be alone or unguarded while this menace prevails. These beings are flesh eaters. They are eating the flesh of the people they kill. The principal characteristic of their onslaught is their depraved, insane quest for human flesh. I repeat, these alien beings are eating the flesh of their victims. Obviously, a radio report that sounds very, very reminiscent of the radio reports that we hear in Night of the Living Dead. I can actually hear that radio report being told in Carl Hardman's voice. Chapter 3. Yeah, this book has very, very short chapters. Again, a la Goosebumps book. Chapter 3. Sheriff Conan McClellan was sipping a cup of morning coffee in his office when the report of the wrecked bus came over the police band. He knew the crossroads and the embankment where the bus had reportedly gone over. The initial report did not mention any fire, and it was not a steep drop. Depending on how fast the bus was going when it had gone over the edge, and if it had managed to avoid the big trees before bringing itself to a halt, there could be survivors. McClellan made sure that a call had gone out for extra ambulances and emergency medical supplies from all the nearby communities. He alerted the emergency rooms of the nearest hospitals. He also phoned the morgue. Then he got into a squad car driven by one of his men, Deputy Green, a rookie, and told Green to head out towards the scene of the accident. Green was nervous, but trying not to show it. He had not yet had occasion to encounter any dead men on the job as a policeman, and from what he had heard from the report and knowing the preparations his superior had made, he was pretty sure he was going to encounter his first bodies that day. Sheriff McClellan was a good man, with the upsetting but perhaps necessary habit of practically hunting for ways to baptize his men by fire. Once they had been through a crisis without buckling, he knew he could depend on them, and he felt they knew they could then depend on themselves. Green was about to become very dependable, McClellan mused. The sheriff himself was more nervous on this call than he usually was, and he knew why. The bus wreck they were fast approaching reminded him too much of the first incident that he had covered as a rookie policeman. A bus carrying grade school children that had been struck head on by a truck overloaded with steel reinforcement rods, the kind that are used to reinforce concrete. The rods had been torn loose on impact and had hurtled like spears through the interior of the school bus, impaling many of the children and tearing off heads and arms. Damn. Thanks, Final Destination, too much? That's fucked up. McClellan had almost resigned from the force as the result of that one accident, deciding his 6-month career as a policeman was enough. Now, after 26 years, he felt he could face whatever the world would throw at him, no matter how terrible. He never showed his emotions, but he never forgot anything or anyone that touched him deeply. His men respected him, but thought he was a bit too thick-skinned to be human. McClellan knew it was the only way to survive his job. Deputy Green knew what he was headed for. He was thinking about the reports he'd heard on the car radio. If he had been alone, he might have driven more slowly, in hopes of getting there after some of the disaster had been cleaned up. But with Sheriff McClellan sitting in the front seat, he could not dawdle. If he wished McClellan had picked someone else to drive him to the scene of the accident, he had the wisdom not to mention it. With the light flashing and the sirens screaming, they were rapidly approaching the scene and would be there in about 10 minutes from the time they had departed police headquarters. The bus had gone over the embankment after negotiating a steep climb in the highway and starting down the other side. A police barricade had been put up along the side of the road, and a patrolman was directing the emergency vehicles to the crash scene, while directing other traffic to continue ahead. Luckily, there was rarely much traffic on this rural road, and if there were any survivors, they could be transferred quickly to a hospital. The patrolman waved McClellan's car on, and Green eased it up over the hill slowly to where they could see the bent and twisted guardrail about 200 yards above the crossroads formed by a bridge over the river and the junction of three highways. Already off the bat, I can just see this southern Pittsburgh wooded, hilly landscape that I really like. I love that kind of setting for zombie stuff. There is no evidence of why the bus had gone out of control. Possibly it had been forced over by a car or truck which had kept going after the bus went over. Green pulled the car over, leaving the lights flashing, and he and the sheriff got out. Far from being late on the scene, they seemed to be among the first to arrive, which did not give Green any comfort. There was one other patrol car parked to one side, as much on the shoulder as possible, its lights still flashing. McClellan figured out that the patrolman directing traffic had come from that car. McClellan looked down along the path of the wrecked bus, but saw nobody moving toward it. In this distance, the bus was clearly not discernible. Its fatal path had taken it into a thick growth of trees, which now concealed the extent of the catastrophe. McClellan mentioned to Green and told him to come along. As he began working his way down toward the wrecked bus, they could see smoke rising out of the trees, but it was certainly not enough smoke for a big fire. Still, this did not give McClellan cause to expect a large number of survivors. If there had been any, he reasoned, their first impulse would be to go for help by climbing out of the woods and onto the road. Since nobody was climbing up, there was probably nobody able to climb. But he noticed from the weeds but he noticed that the weeds were tamped down and there were muddy footprints in places, as though for some reason a considerable number of people had made their way down toward the wreckage. McClellan did not understand that. If a group of people had gone down there, who were they and where could they be? Chapter 4. Anne and Sue Ellen were spattered with blood, their carefully washed and ironed dresses now muddy and torn. Sue Ellen slipped and fell, losing her grip on the legs of the dead man she was helping to carry, and struck her face against the dead man's shoe. A sob came from her throat. Bert Miller offered no word of sympathy or encouragement, but by his stern, angry looks bade his daughter get up and keep going. Sue Ellen dragged herself to her feet, picking up the legs of the corpse, and kept going. Her father had the body by its arms, and he himself was out of breath, but he had to keep going, and so did she. Bert wanted his daughters to learn that life was hard. There were there were tasks to be done, and those with the proper moral fiber did what had to be done without complaining or expecting any reward for it on this earth. He had given Anne and Sue Ellen the choice of either helping to carry the dead or driving the spikes. They elected to carry the bodies of their own free will, so they must do that job, and they must get it done quickly, before the authorities got to the scene to stop them. The authorities did not like to admit the necessity of spiking the dead, though it had clearly been necessary once before. Sue Ellen and her father got the dead man to a clearing in the woods where other dead bodies were laid out. They dropped the man down, and the girl turned away his head lolled crazily to one side, exposing the gash that had almost severed the head from its neck. Sue Ellen covered her eyes with her hands, then remembered too late that her hands were bloody. She pulled them away, but left a fresh smear of blood on each cheek. She began to cry. She could hear her father's hoarse breathing as he rested for a moment and watched as Anne struggled while dragging the body of a 3-year-old child through the weeds and into the clearing. A large wooden splinter, part of a sheared off tree branch, was stuck in the child's chest. The child's mouth was open and its teeth were caked with blood. Bert Miller had made Anne drag the child's body alone, while he and Sue Ellen carried the dead man, a much heavier burden. The man and the child were the last of the bodies to be carried from the wreckage of the bus. Others in the clearing had already begun to drive the spikes. That's fucked up. But it's very George Romero-esque. They're very blunt and grim and unapologetic. So, I mean, John Russo, you got to give you credit. You're really trying to be consistent with George Romero stuff. Anne and Sue Ellen collapsed on the ground, panting, near shock, not looking at each other, because each reminded the other of the horrible experience they had both been through. Each felt alone, frightened beyond comprehension, wanting to run and hide out of sight of the activity in the clearing, which filled them with such revulsion that they both shut their eyes against it. But they could hear it, the cacophony of wood against metal, the splitting of dead skulls, accompanied by the hoarse breathing and cries and comments of those who were using the spikes and mallets. The bus wreck had left no survivors. Reverend Michaels strode among the dead bodies, most of them horribly mangled, and over each one he stopped and hurriedly said the prayer designed to help ensure the eternal peace of death. Now and then, in his feverish work, he took time to encourage his parishioners and to praise them for having the strength to carry out God's work. Hurry, hurry, Michael shouted. We must spike as many as possible before the police come. When they heard the sounds of police sirens, the people became afraid and knew they must leave at once, even if they had not finished their work. 13 corpses had been spiked out of a total of 34 dead. Jeez. Reverend Michael shook his head, hoping his prayers would be sufficient for the unspiked bodies. Then he led his congregation out of the clearing and away from the woods towards the valley from which they had come. They went quietly and furtively by a back way by which they would encounter no police or other intruders who might disapprove of what they had done, of how the dead had been treated. The Reverend prayed as he made his way through the woods, asking the Lord's help for the 21 corpses that had not been spiked, asking him to grant them eternal peace. He knew that they were easy prey to forces unbelievable in their horror. At that time, with the last several bodies were being spiked, Sheriff McClellan and Deputy Green were working their way down to where the bus lay broken and shattered. In the distance, they heard the rhythmical sounds of wood striking against metal and wondered what they were. They searched the weeds with their eyes as they walked, half expecting to find broken bodies thrown clear of the wreckage, but they saw nothing and there was no evidence of survivors. When they reached the bus, it was empty. There were some thin plumes of smoke rising from the body of the bus, but there seemed to be no danger of explosion. The inside appeared to be a bloody mess. There was evidence of carnage on a dreadful scale, but no dead or wounded remained. All the passengers, dead or living, had disappeared. Amid the twisted metal and shards of broken glass, Green's eyes fell on a bloody severed hand, and it made him gag. He gulped and pointed, showing it to McClellan, who looked but said nothing. He himself had noticed what looked like a finger or a piece of a finger lying partially under a brand new powder blue lady's suitcase, but he did not feel it necessary to tell Green. If they had wanted to sift through the debris, they would have doubtless have found more bits and pieces of human bodies, along with broken teeth and eyeglasses. But at this point, they were far more interested in what happened to the people who survived or did not survive this disaster. Already ramping up the tension and the suspense in true Night of the Living Dead fashion. It's a shame this book has not been made into a movie. McClellan knew then that the tramped down weeds leading from the road to the clearing must have been caused by a large group of people going to the site of the wrecked bus. They had carried off the dead bodies, or the survivors, if there were any. But why? Perhaps they felt it a necessary thing to do, fearing the bus might explode before the survivors could be rescued and the dead identified. Except to McClellan, there did not seem to be any real danger of an explosion. Whatever small fire had caused the smoke, perhaps a lit cigarette had fallen amongst some spilled luggage, had burned itself out quickly, and had not been burning in the vicinity of any fuel lines likely to ignite. Somebody dragged the people out of here, McClellan said. Look for trampled down places through the woods. We can probably figure out which way they went. Green stared, dumbfounded. Both he and McClellan had stepped down out of the bus, and Green was glad to be out of there. He had really hoped they would be heading back up the hill toward the patrol car. Get moving, McClellan snapped at his rookie. You can't quit a job in the middle of it. Those people didn't sprout wings and fly into heaven like angels. If they're all dead, somebody moved them. We have to find out where, in case some of them ain't dead and need help. Looters? Green suggested, anxious to show he was thinking, though he was embarrassed by McClellan's bawling out. Possibly, the sheriff conceded. But if they was scavengers, why didn't they take all the luggage? He let his question hang in the air as his eyes searched out a place where it looked as though the woods had been penetrated. Green stepped up beside McClellan, and they both drew their pistols. If there was a chance they might actually surprise a gang of looters, they wanted to be ready. They proceeded cautiously, not wishing to be surprised. If there were looters, they might have a lookout lying in ambush. The two men made their way through some crushed down weeds toward the surrounding woods. Green, the young deputy, was alert and strong looking, if a little unnerved. He was 23 years old, tall and handsome in his patrolman's uniform. McClellan was older by 25 years, paunchy but barrel-chested. A little slow and short-winded maybe, but a hard man to knock down. And if he stayed on his feet and got a chance to deliver a punch or two, whoever he hit would be the one to go down. McClellan was wise and slow, like an old bear. Green, the younger man, had the fine reflexes of youth, but was still untried and undisciplined. The knocks and bruises and experiences of years of hard, patient work would come. The woods had the feel of silence not tempered by man's presence. When man is nearby, certain animals behave and sound differently, or make no sound at all. McClellan noticed the change in the sounds as he and Green made their way in amongst the trees. It caused him to sense that if there had been a group of people busy somewhere back in the woods, they had probably all fled. Without explaining to Green, he began to move faster and to worry less about looters or a possible ambush. It was not hard for the men to track down where the injured or dead bodies had been taken. A plainly legible trail of blood, torn clothing, footprints, and smashed down weeds led to the clearing in the woods. McClellan and Green approached the clearing with caution, pistols ready. Concealing themselves behind trees, they saw that nobody was stirring, and they moved into the clearing. They saw irregular rows of mangled bodies lying flat on their backs with some spikes driven into their skulls. For a long moment, neither McClellan nor Green moved or spoke. Then, wordlessly, they moved to the edges of the clearing and skirted it rapidly, sweeping the surrounding trees and bushes with their pistols and their eyes. They saw no signs of the presence of other people, so they put their pistols away, bad idea, and stood silently among the torn and mutilated bodies. Check and see if any are alive, McClellan said finally, and he and Green went from one bloody body to another, only to find no signs of life. Not the work of scavengers, McClellan said, breaking the grim silence. The spikes, Green managed to stammer. Somebody thinks it's happening again. We must have scared them off before they could finish. Green looked questioningly at the sheriff. You're not from here, Green, McClellan said. This area was one of the hardest hit 10 years ago, remember? The dead had to be burned or decapitated. The brain had to be destroyed. I don't know if those creatures were really dead or not in the usual sense. Nobody knows. But somebody is afraid it's going to happen again. That's why there are spikes in the heads. Green blanched. It can't happen again, he said. It was brought under control. I remember. I was only 13 years old. We read about it, saw it on TV, and still didn't want to believe it. There is very little of the disease in my town, but there was some, enough to convince us that it was real. It was real enough, McClellan said. Something I try to forget, want to forget, but it was real, all right. It can't happen again, Green repeated, as though saying it again would make it true because he wanted to believe it. I don't know, McClellan said. I hope so, but they never did find out sure what caused it. Maybe it can come back, like a plague of tent worms or Japanese beetles. He tried to chuckle, having intended his last comment as an attempt to lighten the moment, but no chuckle came, and the comment just hung in the air. Ah, late 70s light racist jokes. I'm only laughing because it's dated and stupid. I'll probably read for a couple more chapters. Yeah. Because I don't want each video to be super long. Green was still staring at the rows of bodies. He had drawn his pistol again, almost involuntarily, but it stayed at his side, useless. Come on, McClellan said. You and me have got to snap out of it. There'll be people here soon. Ambulance attendants and probably reporters. Nosy sons of bitches. I'll stand guard here. You go on back to the bus and show the ambulance people where to come. It did not escape Green that the sheriff had said they must both snap out of it. McClellan was being kind, showing Green that he was just as rattled as he was and that there was no shame in it. Green experienced a flicker of closeness and respect for the sheriff. As he made his way back toward the wrecked bus, he called to mind something that he had read once which had impressed him upon reading it. The brave man and the coward are both afraid, but the coward runs and the brave man does not. When Green got back to the bus, 7 or 8 ambulance attendants and a doctor had arrived on the scene and had probably been there several minutes. They were milling around, shocked and uncomprehending, asking each other questions none of them could answer. Like the patrolmen, they were more thrown by the absence of bodies than they would have been by a score of mangled and mutilated people. They could deal with corpses or wounded. It was what they had been trained to do. But the absence of dead and wounded in a situation where they had been anticipated stumped the ambulance people and made them feel somehow disoriented and uneasy. The situation made no sense to them, and they felt vaguely uncomfortable. As Green approached, they looked at him hopefully, expecting that he would tell them what to do. This way, Green said, pointing back to the woods. The bus passengers are back there. Then, lowering his voice, he added, You won't need anything but stretchers, no medical supplies. They're all dead. In the distance, scrambling down over the hill from where the bus had broken through the guardrail, Green spotted an approaching crowd. They were carrying equipment which, when they got closer, he realized were cameras and tripods. News reporters, television, and newspaper people were suddenly everywhere, and Green debated for an instant whether or not he should remain by the bus to try to keep the reporters and cameramen corralled here. But he knew they wouldn't listen. When they found the bus empty, they would follow the ambulance people into the woods. When more police arrived, they could cordon off the area surrounding the clearing. But by then, it would be too late. The bodies would be on their way up the hill on stretchers. The reporters would see everything and get the full story. It would make a big splash, frighten people out of their wits, and recall the plague that had happened 10 years ago. Green shrugged resignedly. He knew there was no way to keep the grisly event out of the news. Turning his back on the advancing scene, he started walking toward that terrible scene, hidden in the woods. Chapter 5. Excerpt from a civil defense broadcast 10 years earlier. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is now midnight Eastern Standard Time. This is your Civil Defense Emergency Broadcast Network with reports every hour on the hour for the duration of this emergency. Stay tuned to this wavelength for survival information. Ladies and gentlemen, incredible as it may seem, the latest report from the Pentagon and the President's research team at Walter Reed Hospital confirms what many of us already believe. The army of aggressors, which has besieged many of the eastern and midwestern states of our country, is made up of dead human beings. I could have told you that for free. The recently dead have been returning to life by some unknown force and feasting on human flesh. The dead from morgues, hospitals, funeral parlors, as well as many of those killed during or as a result of the chaos created during this emergency, have been returned to life in a depraved, incomplete form, and they have come back among us with an urge to kill other humans and devour their flesh. Explanations for the causes of this incredible phenomenon are not forthcoming from the Walter Reed team, the White House, or from any governmental authority at this moment, but speculation centers on the recent Venus mission, which was unsuccessful. That space probe started for Venus more than a week ago, but the ship swerved off course and never entered the planet's atmosphere. Instead, it returned to Earth, crashing into the Atlantic Ocean. It carried a mysterious high-level radiation with it, the origins of which are still, we are led to believe, unknown. Could that radiation have been responsible for the epidemic of death and horror we are now witnessing? Speculation on the answer or answers to that question has run rampant here in Washington and elsewhere. While the White House has maintained a curtain of silence on scientific theories and is attempting to deal with the emergency on a retaliatory basis, the government is organizing resistance teams in the form of search and destroy squadrons against the aggressors. The details of these missions are not known. At present, meetings at the Pentagon and the White House have remained closed to reporters, and members of the military and civilian advisors have refused to conduct interviews or to answer questions posed by reporters on their way to or from such meetings. I feel better now. I repeat, the latest official communique from the Pentagon has confirmed that the aggressors are dead. They are not invaders from another planet. They are the recently dead from right here on Earth. Not all of the recently dead have returned to life, but in certain areas of the country, the eastern seaboard and the Midwest in particular, the phenomenon is more widespread than elsewhere. Why the Midwest should be an area so greatly afflicted cannot be explained, even by the wildest speculation. Perhaps the nearness to our coastline of the Venus probe's reentry is a factor. At this moment, we have no answers. Perhaps we shall never know the exact reasons for the terrible phenomenon we are now witnessing. There is some hope, however. that the menace will be brought under control, perhaps in a matter of several days or weeks. It has been discovered that the aggressors can be killed, or is it killed again, by a gunshot or a heavy blow to the head. They are aware of fire and they burn easily. These beings have all the characteristics of dead people, except they are not dead. And for reasons we do not as yet understand, their brains have been activated and they are cannibals. I have just been handed a new bulletin which states that it has been learned that anyone who dies from a wound inflicted by the flesh eaters may himself come back to life in the same form as the aggressors themselves. The disease, or whatever it is that these beings carry, is communicable through open flesh wounds or scratches and take effect minutes after the apparent death of the wounded person. Anyone who dies during the emergency should be decapitated or cremated immediately. Survivors will find these measures emotionally difficult to undertake, but they must be undertaken anyway, or else the authorities must be alerted to undertake them for you. Those who die during the emergency are not corpses in the usual sense. They are dead flesh, but highly dangerous and a threat to all life on our planet. I repeat, bodies of those who die during this emergency must be burned or decapitated. Again, sounding very reminiscent of Night of the Living Dead. I'll read one more chapter, then we'll call it that for this first part. Obviously, not going to be a two-part series. I was wrong. On the screen of the television above the bar, there was coverage of the bus wreck and of the bizarre events which followed. The commentary had been long and sensational. The news cameras dwelling unnecessarily, McClellan thought, on the mangled bodies being transported on stretchers from the bloody clearing in the woods. Most of the stretchers were covered, and the condition of the corpses could not be seen clearly, but the commentator's voice filled in the gory details the video was mercifully lacking. McClellan purposely averted his eyes from the screen. He and Green had stopped off for a drink to try to blur some of the day's images. Both men were completely drained, both physically and emotionally, and needed a quiet place to sit and try to sort out what they had seen. They had chosen this particular place because it was seldom crowded, and when they entered the bar room, it was empty of customers as they had hoped. The sheriff had ordered a shot and a beer, and Green had followed suit. They downed their shots without a word, neither of them feeling like talking, though they were glad for each other's company and had just picked up their beers when the door to the place banged open and a man entered the dim room. He staggered a little, sizing up the place and its potential for suitable diversion, then walked over to the bar and sat down on the stool next to McClellan. McClellan tried not to look directly at the man. He did not know him and did not wish to make his acquaintance. He particularly did not wish to be drawn into an inane conversation with a drunk after all he had recently been through. And having the day's events played back on the television put him even more on edge. The man was dressed in blue coveralls and was carrying a metal lunch bucket which he slammed down onto the bar while yelling at the bartender to serve him a double header of Seagram 7 and a bottle of Budweiser. Once served, the man quickly downed his whiskey and ordered another, then turned his bloodshot eyes to the flickering screen above the bar. While the newscast was in progress, he would belch or snort at passages he found wryly amusing, or would look directly at McClellan as if he expected the sheriff to belch or snort in agreement. When the belches and snorts got no response, the drunk began to mutter, and when the muttering still got no response, he began to throw in loud comments. The two policemen were sitting in silence. McClellan tried to keep his head turned towards Green in hopes that the drunk would take the hint and keep quiet. But the sheriff's eyes darted towards the screen when he heard his own voice, recorded earlier that day during an interview at the scene of the bus accident. "You tell him, Sheriff," the drunk said, spinning around in time to catch McClellan's eyes and as he glanced at the TV. Yeah, McClellan sighed under his breath. Green looked over and smiled at his partner in an attempt to be sympathetic. He knew the last thing McClellan wanted to do was talk about the afternoon's events. The drunk went on talking, slurring his words. "Sheriff, I think them people are right. Let 'em pound the goddamn nails in, just to be sure, know what I mean?" McClellan slid off his stool, pulled out his wallet, and slapped some bills down on the bar. "Green, let's get out of here." The bartender came over and counted the money, the drunk shouting after the two lawmen as they went out the door. "It happened before. It can happen again. You seen it, Sheriff. You seen it with your own eyes." McClellan and Green stepped out into the night air and kept walking, both wishing to put some distance between themselves and the saloon. The night air seemed very clear, the black sky illuminated by countless stars. A sparse but steady stream of automobile traffic moved along the streets where the two lawmen were walking, the street forming one of the outer boundaries of a small park. "Let's get out of here," said McClellan, walking swiftly. "Will you drop me off at home? My wife has the car." They picked their way through traffic and headed towards their patrol car, parked on the outer edge of the park. As they approached the car, Green suddenly stopped and flung out his arm to stop McClellan. "You hear that?" he asked, staring toward a clump of trees 25 yards away. His voice was barely a whisper. They both stood perfectly still, listening. They heard rustling leaves and what sounded like a scuffle, then a muffled female scream. Pulling out their service revolvers, they began to run. They raced into the darkened park and saw three struggling figures, two of which were silhouetted against the star-studded sky. As noticing the men running towards them, they got up to flee. Two men had been grappling with a woman. The interruption had enabled her to get to her feet, but one of the men knocked her down as he tried to make his escape. "Halt! Police!" Green yelled. McClellan fired a warning shot into the air. Green looked down and, trying not to trip over the ivy-ground cover as they ran deeper into the park, did not see one of the shadowy figures dive into a clump of bushes just as McClellan fired his gun. Green blinked his eyes, trying to get used to the darkness. "Do you guys not have flashlights?" He continued to move forward, his revolver drawn. The woman, still down on the ground, hurt and exhausted, had managed to grab the ankle of her assailant as he tried to escape from the scene, and with the energy that often comes to those during an emergency, she was doggedly holding on. The man was balancing himself on one leg, shaking and kicking his other leg, hoping he could get the woman to loosen her grip. He finally lashed out with a solid kick, his heavy boot heel smashing into the woman's jaw with a oh shit, with a loud snapping sound. She went limp, her neck broken. Damn. Green reached the man at just that moment, leaped at him with a flying tackle, and they both went down heavily, rolling on the ground. The man untangled himself from Green's hold and got to his feet, with Green after him. Suddenly, a shot exploded from the bush, and Green reeled, staggered momentarily, and fell. McClellan immediately fired and hit the man behind the bush, a square shot right in the chest, slamming the man over backwards like a duck in a shooting gallery. The other assailant was still on the run, going out of the park towards the street. McClellan turned his body slowly, following the running man with the barrel of his revolver, patiently timing the shot. The man began running and dodging through a burst of traffic. Brakes squealed as startled drivers tried to avoid the zigzagging figure. McClellan squeezed his trigger. Bye, honey. See you in a bit. And the running man received the blast, jerking, lunging forward, and slamming headfirst across the hood of a parked car on the far side of the street. Bonk. McClellan stepped over to Green, knelt, felt Green's chest, and came away with a bloody hand. He put 2 fingers on Green's wrist, but there was no pulse. Green was dead. Ouch. McClellan wiped his hands in the grass. He checked the woman. She was dead too. Her neck was broken, her head angled grotesquely off to one side. Her clothes were partially torn, her face, shoulders, and thighs bruised. Rape sickened him. What had probably started as a mugging had ended like this. McClellan had seen it too many times. Ouch. His gun ready, the sheriff approached the parked car where the man he had shot lay sprawled across the hood. His headlong dive had been stopped by the windshield, his head cracking against the glass and shattering it into a pattern like a spider's web. McClellan opened the door of the car, left foolishly unlocked by its owner, he noticed, and looked at the wide-open eyes of the dead man through the cracked windshield. Was a wallet or some sex worth dying this stupid way? And the deaths of the 2 men could not make up for the loss of Green. 4 more dead in a day of death, thought McClellan. There is nothing to do but notify Green's family and phone the morgue. The sheriff stayed on hand, directing traffic and keeping curious onlookers away until the patrol cars and the morgue's ambulance arrived. Then he went home to bed, tired, but knowing beforehand he would be unable to sleep. Alrighty, I'm going to stop there. Obviously, yeah, this is not going to be a 2-part series. This will probably be a few. Obviously, not much to commentate about. Starting with that, the story is just getting started. There's a lot of setup and build-up, but it definitely does really cement itself as being another alternative sequel to Night of the Living Dead, which I now realize that there are 4 different continuities that have sprung off from Night of the Living Dead. There's George Romero's movies, Night, Dawn, Day, so on and so forth. So that's 1. Then there's Night of the Living Dead, Night of the Living Dead 30th Anniversary Edition, and Children of the Living Dead, which becomes its own thing. There's this continuity, which is 3, Night of the Living Dead, and then Return of the Living Dead. And then finally, there's Night of the Living Dead and Escape of the Living Dead, the comic series that takes place in 1971. So yeah, 4 different continuities. It's a mess. Alrighty. I certainly am enjoying it so far, though. It's very intriguing, and it's definitely got a good start going. Post your comments down below. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, share this video with your friends. Look forward to next week. I will continue this. I'll probably try to have 2 videos out next week. Yeah, as always, go out, and if you see a bus crash, just leave it alone. Go home, lock your doors, get a gun, just leave it alone. And I will see you guys in the next video.